In this video, I'm going to introduce the idea of functions in C, which work very similar to other functions in other programming languages. However, there's some small differences that are rather interesting to look at when we look at this concept. So let's start off by discussing a basic idea of functions. So a function is really going to be, as we have in this main function here, it's a block of code that executes when the function is actually called. Best used for things like reducing code repetition or being able to, use a specific functionality in multiple different locations, really is the main goal of a function. The way that we declare a function is shown through this main. We have a type, which is the return type of the function. We can set it to void if there is no return type. And then we have the name of the function, which could be whatever you would like to name the function. And then you have the parameters of the function, so the things that we want to actually give to that function to be able to use. So for example, if I wanted to take a function that takes in two integer values, adds them together, and returns that result, here's what it would look like. We would have int, which is the return type. Then I would have add, and then I would have my two parameters, a and b, I'll call them. And then my return is going to be similar to the main return there. We're going to return, in this case, a plus b is what I want to return. Now, just to note, if I didn't want to return something, like I said before, you could set this to void. That indicates that there is no return. In this case, there is a return, which is an integer value. So we set this to int. Now, watch what happens if I try to call this function. Let's say that I want to say printf. And then I want to do something like %d. And then I want to print out the value of adding 2 and 3 together. I'd expect that to be 5, right? Let's take a look at what happens when I try to compile here. Do you see that I get a warning that says implicit declaration of function add? What's happening here is when we work in C, there's basically two different ways that we can work with functions. There's implicit and then there's an explicit declaration. And the idea is that when the compiler is looking at this file, basically it looks from top to bottom. And it doesn't really see the definition of the function until it actually gets to the function itself. So what happens is when it gets to like this line of code here, it doesn't necessarily know context about what parameters this function requires and what kind of return type this function has. So this would be the idea of an implicit declaration because it doesn't know any context about the actual function itself. It's just kind of assuming that what you have is correct. And you'll see that when you get this warning, the code still runs. So there's no problem with the code necessarily. It's just that C isn't able to check things like the types of the variables, what kind of variables are being passed in, this type of idea. To help this, what we do is we put at the top of the file the actual function declaration in terms of the return type of the function, the name of the function, and the parameters that are passed into it. So in this case, I have a return of int. The function name is add, and it takes in two integers. So we just say int and int. What this does is it gives the compiler context towards what this function requires. It knows that now that it returns an int, and it takes in two integers as arguments. So now C will be able to process this and then understand once it hits this add that it's an integer that it returns and that it takes in two integers. This gives C all the context that it needs, making this no longer an implicit declaration. So now when I clear this, when I compile, we compile without any sorts of warnings. Now it's best to do this type of implicit declaration, or explicit declaration rather, because it's going to allow us to catch any sort of errors related to things like, if this, for instance, was set to, say, float instead of integer, now the compiler will actually see that and say, hey, this is supposed to be an integer, but it's formatted as a double, right? So it'll give us those types of compiler warnings and errors when we have that type of declaration set. So it's a lot better at scanning those types of errors when we have that declaration. So it's always recommended to do that. So with that, you should now have a pretty good understanding of the way that functions work. Like I said, they work very similar to any other programming language. We have a return type, we have parameters that we pass into the functions, just with that main difference of that we declare functions at the top of the file to give that explicit declaration of that function itself. And you'll actually see that as we continue on through here, there are other ways of putting this declaration. So we don't always put it in the main file itself here. Sometimes we put it in header files, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But for now, we can just sort of say, yeah, we have to declare it somewhere so that the compiler has that context, and then we're good to go. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.